Looking back at the last 5 years and even previous to that, I'm able to pinpoint when things got really bad for me, when things started to escalate, and when my depression, quote unquote, began. But that's probably 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and I didn't know it. But that's certainly not the beginning of my struggles mentally. And looking back in hindsight, I would think that I began to deal with mental health issues as far back as I can remember. I think of myself as a kid when I was living on Vancouver Island in Nanaimo, and growing up in a fairly sheltered household with fairly conservative and by the book parents in a certain regard, and living at home and not necessarily experiencing too much out of the house on a day-to-day basis. I was brought up a certain way, and I was brought up really well. I have really good parents, and I believe I've turned out to be a good person with good morals and values. But when I was a kid, there are certain things when looking back that stood out to me as some signs that things weren't necessarily working right in my mind, and those signs are above and beyond the typical tantrums that a kid might throw or a teenager might have in an argument with a parent. They're more lengthy, they're more debilitating. And when I was going through those things as a kid, I thought those were just normal. So an example of that would be not getting what I want, getting into a fight with my parents or an argument with my parents, being sent to my room. And for a lot of kids, the punishment is being sent to your room, and you've lost the battle. You're in your room, you sulk a little bit, and then you deal with the fact that you're in your room. You didn't get what you want. You figure out how to entertain yourself some way or another, read a book, a magazine, listen to some music, draw, hockey cards, whatever it is in your room to entertain yourself until your punishment is over, and you go apologize, and you're back on your way as a kid at home with your regular routine. But that's not how it went for me. And more often than not, the fight, the argument, and then the punishment was just the beginning. I would be sent to my room, and I would ruminate and basically shut off for hours. I would feel like the world was ending. I would feel like there's no point even attempting to feel better. I would lie on the floor for hours on end, and it wouldn't get better. I wouldn't be able to move on, and I would start to feel really, really bad about myself. That was a common occurrence. It's something that I basically went through every time that there was an argument or a confrontation that was a seemingly normal one that a kid would have, but I didn't handle it normally, and it took me a long time to get over. And now, knowing what I know, that's something that I know is associated with my mental illness and the struggles that I have had mentally, and that I still deal with that kind of stuff today, in that when I'm not in a good place mentally, when I know that I could be healthier mentally, things get me down a lot quicker, and then they hit me a lot harder, in that I can't get over them for a long time. They could be the most minuscule and minute things, such as dropping and breaking a dish, or missing a movie time, or things that are inconsequential that don't really affect the quality of my life. I can't get over them. It takes me hours, and it could ruin my day. It could ruin the next day as well. And when I'm weak mentally, not weak as in the opposite of strong, but weak as in unhealthy mentally, I suffer in that way. And as I said, looking back, it dates back to my childhood, and so those are some signs that something might not be right. That specifically, if the conversation was what it is today, would be a clear sign to me as a parent that something is going on in my kid's head that doesn't allow him to deal with anger and negative feelings in the way that maybe kids should typically. So that is when, in my mind, the first signs of my mental illness really took root. But things then began to become more apparent to me when I was an adult, and I left home for the first time to go to university. I lived on the island in Nanaimo, British Columbia. I left home, moved to the big city, Vancouver, for the first time, was pretty much living on my own for the first time, even though I was insulated in that I was living with a family member overseas and didn't need to deal with a lot of this overseas. Yeah, Nanaimo to Vancouver is overseas. But I was living with a family member, didn't have to deal with a lot of the stresses that somebody living on their own would normally, like heating bills and TV bills and all that. I really just had to take care of myself and my lunch and whatever, and my finances and all that other stuff. But the housing stuff was kind of taken care of on its own. So it wasn't too bad for me in terms of being out on my own for the first time, but it still was a big change. And going to university was a really big change too, in that I went from being a really good student with really good grades and I guess fairly popular or averagely popular in high school to struggling at university. I was almost on academic probation in my first semester. I started to do quite poorly. One, because I think my studying habits were not great, because school came easy to me in high school, but two, because there was a lot going on, and I probably wasn't paying as much attention to school as I could have been. But once that hit me and I was almost on academic probation, and the stress of disappointing my parents and potentially getting kicked out of university began to hit me, I didn't have anybody to lean on but myself to fix that. And so I started to feel the pressures of life, and that began to grow when I was clear that I wasn't in the right field of study, and I was trying to figure out, okay, what do I need to do with my life and my university life specifically? Where do I need to go? And I tried different things, and the pressures of not knowing where I'm going and what the implications might be started to weigh on me, and I started to get beaten down. I wasn't taking care of myself, not nearly as well as I could have been, and as I was in the first couple semesters and years of my university life, when I was just enjoying myself and having fun. When the pressures of being kicked out, not getting a job after, and not knowing where I was going, and spending money unnecessarily in my mind, when those started to become apparent, that started to weigh me down. I started to focus less on self-care, and I felt the weight of every single decision, and didn't know how to deal with it. And so that started to take a toll on me quite heavily in university, and I started to become a different person. Not only was I dealing with a lot of the issues that I dealt with as a child, and as I just explained, but I started to become angrier, shorter, less sensitive, less empathetic, and it took a toll on my relationships. My wife now, who was my girlfriend at that point, we actually broke up a couple times, and I would probably say that it was mainly because of me not being emotionally available and not being a good partner, because of my inability to cope with stress. And that was something that was basically, for me, the first time that I was truly depressed, in that I was not motivated. I was easily irritable. I was scared of making decisions. I took my anger out on other people, and I wasn't enjoying my life. And it was something that happened every day and got worse every day. And at a certain point, I was a changed person. I got out of that, and I got out of that without knowing what I was dealing with. I'm not even sure how I got out of that. And I think how I got out of it was, finding something that I was passionate about. and a couple people specifically who had similar interests, who I could, spend time with pursuing those interests and not worrying about the future or the past, but just the present, and not being in my own head. And that, taking me out of my own head just took me out of all the issues that were going in my head. And over time, it helped, cure a lot of those issues. But it didn't cure the problem. And that's something that I'll talk about coming up here. But that's how I got through it at that point. It wasn't the end of my mental health struggles, and wasn't the end of me dealing with mental illness and depression specifically. And in fact, it was barely the beginning. But if I was to pinpoint my first bout of depression, it would be at that time in university, because what was to come really highlighted that it had happened before. But I couldn't really pinpoint that until I dealt with it the next time, which was when I was at CTV in my first real professional job.